Hello pandas and other scrap enthusiasts, and welcome back to the shop. No dumpster diving today, I've got something else in mind. See, I've been putting this off, but around here there's quite a few transformers and motors sitting around in need of processing. And as we've shown in the past, there's a couple different ways to extract the copper, like going after it with an angle grinder, or chopping the things apart with a machete, or what have you, and these have different advantages and disadvantages. But what's more fun than doing actual work? Procrastinating and making a custom tool.
So, out we go to the scrap pile. The scrap pile where we're saving pieces to grab what I think should work pretty well for this. This old saw blade. There's lots of material here anyway. So first thing, we're going to clean some of the rust off just so it's a little nicer to work with. And mark off, we're just going to make a guess, well, a couple guesses, and come up with a shape. That should do fine. And then we got to cut it out. Yes, I realize I could use a torch, but I don't know. This seems fine. And the amount of sparks and the difficulty I had cutting this thing apart, I'm actually pretty optimistic about that. It might be a decent candidate. We'll see. A little more cleanup to do. Now, I will say, I'm aware there are different kinds of steel, and this particular piece, I don't necessarily think it'll be a high carbon steel, but because it wasn't carbide tipped saw blade, I'm hoping maybe it's medium carbon steel. Now, in order to put a bevel or shape the edge, I've only really got this one tool. So we're gonna go with whatever angle is the easiest to create with that. And yeah, I did learn I should be keeping it cool with some water. But we got there. We got it figured out.
Alright, well, I'm no bladesmith, and I don't think it will heal, but I have made a big gnarly F-off blade that I think should be suitable for our purposes. Not to mention a big pile of steel wool dust stuff. Yeah, we had to take off quite a bit of material. I do think I got it down to an acceptable edge for our purposes, although the taper is not perfect. I'm not surprised because I was just holding it by hand. No real jig to hold it to get it just dialed in. And I went with a single taper because I think that should help it stay strong and last through the abuse that we're planning on putting it through. Speaking of keeping it strong, that moves us on to the next step. See, all of that machining, the power tools have definitely ruined the temper and the hardening that this thing may have had. So the next step is to attempt to restore that. Now, this is not the correct tool for this job, but it's what we have, and it should work a little better than a torch. Terrifying!
Now we're just going to let this thing cook. And my understanding from my bit of research is that it's supposed to keep going and keep heating up until it loses magnetism. And this, there's some certain word for it. I forget. But that's the theory. And now that it is no longer magnetic, we're going to quench it. Well, it's mostly not magnetic. The point is, it's done. We're going to quench it in some used motor oil. Now, there were a couple things that happened really quickly from this point going forward. along with those things, or perhaps because of them, I ended up making a steel Pringle. A rather sharp, but rather soft steel Pringle. So, since this one was obviously ruined, I made a new blank. And this one is a little more narrow, and I didn't quite shape the edge down all the way. It's just almost its final thickness. But being thinner, it should be able to fit all the way inside the kiln, so I can control the temperature a lot more consistently. And I started things a little differently and put it through a slow heat up and followed that with a slow cool down, because this is supposed to normalize the steel, which does a couple different things. I'm not going to act like the expert here, but we completed that, and it did not warp from that process. An unexpected result of this, though, is we cleaned off a little bit of this scale just to test it, and it seemed to be a lot harder than the first one. And this came from the same saw blade. This was not what I was expecting at all.
Now, at this point, I really don't know what to think. I knew this was going to be a fairly low carbon steel in the first place, but what I was expecting to see was the normalization process would leave the file digging in just like it was with the first one, but it seems to be harder now, and that doesn't really align with what I'd read so far about hardening different types of steels. My expectation was that I would then have to bring it up to the non-magnetic temperature and then quench it in water, and I was worried that that would be where the warping happened. But the fact that it's fairly resistant to filing already makes me fairly resistant to putting it through any more experimental phases, because I feel like I've gotten the best I'm going to get from this piece of metal already. Now, that doesn't make a lot of sense with all of the digging around on the internet that I had done. I thought I was going to quench it, find it then harder, and then anneal it a couple times, and that would be a cool process as well. But at this point, with the failures behind us, and something that seems like it'll get the job done already, I'm not going to question it. I also really like the finish that we've ended up with, this like kind of this scorched blue gray, so I'm not going to do a whole lot of sanding or finishing to it. I think I'm just gonna scuff the scale off of the surface, and then we're going to see just how well this thing works.
So throw it in a vise and give it a little bit of a file just to give it that final sharpness that I was going for. And then forgive the shutter speed on my camera. We've got a collection of pieces to test it out on. So we're going to start with this one, what we typically would use a tool like this for, because it's a little too small to use the angle grind. Okay. It's already curling over a little bit, but that could be because of the coating or whatever. I don't know. Test it out on a transformer. This seems to be going much better. I'm optimistic about this. And we're going to give it the business, get through that copper. I think a lot of resistance there. That doesn't seem right. Ah. Yes. Okay.
Alright, well, there's no sense dancing around it. This tool sucks. It peeled open like a tin can. I may as well have cut a sheet out of a tin can and been using that. This didn't work at all, and I clearly don't know what I'm doing. Some of you who do know what you're doing probably saw this coming, so feel free to be as smug as you like in the comments. And bonus points, I don't have enough time left this week to come up with something else or recover this to make a more satisfying video. This is where we ended up. This is just what happens sometimes when you take a figure it out as you go approach, for which I am not apologizing, and neither should you, because how else are we going to learn if we don't try? Now, one thing I have learned, and if someone's looking for something similar like this but works really good, well, the machete works okay, but they're not really made that well. What I find works a little better is a simple cleaver. Now, I actually like this one a lot, but I do worry about destroying it. So in this application, it is kind of a consumable. And if you want to save yourself the heartache, search for something like this, because it actually works a treat. But you might want to find the biggest, baddest, meanest one. And essentially the lesson here is the steel makes a huge difference. Look at the damage on this. I'm not sure if hardening this would have saved it at all. I think the whole item is just way too soft a piece of steel. If I revisit this in the future, and I would like to, because the dimensions of this and the width make it a lot better than something like the hatchet, which just kind of gets buried. You really need something that extends all the way up past the full length of your motor, which is what we were trying to do here. Upon revisiting, I would like to probably double this up so that it's a little bit more, there's a little more sturdiness to it. And instead of using this steel as an edge, find an old file or some other piece of tool steel with a very high carbon content that I could harden properly that would take an edge. And then we'd simply weld it onto the end of this and make that the leading edge and sharpen that up. I do think this is worth making a custom tool for, because it is just that useful to be able to split these things open without having to spray dust everywhere. Which is why I was excited to share this with you. Unfortunately, it didn't work out this time. That's okay, and I hope you'll look forward to trying it again. If you have any tips or suggestions, I am definitely open to learning more about this process. Because I feel like with the tools that we have around, we could make something passable. We could even make something amazing. Maybe even as amazing as you. I look forward to seeing you on the next one. Thanks for hanging out. Leave it better than you found it. Keep doing the thing.